Hi, my name's Beth, and I'm a programming coordinator for the St. Johns County Public Library System. We are celebrating St. Johns County's 200th anniversary all throughout 2021. But as everybody in our community knows, our history in this area goes back much, much further than just 200 years. In fact, I'm here at the Mission Nombre de Dios in downtown St. Augustine, here on the anniversary of St. Augustine's founding day from 1565. And of course the history even goes much further than that. I'm about to meet with Dr. Timothy Johnson. He is the Distinguished Professor of Religion at Flagler College, and he recently discovered a Spanish Timucua book that was written by the Franciscan Friar Francisco Pareja. It was published in Mexico in 1628. It was previously unknown to scholars and was basically hiding in plain sight at a library at Oxford University. The native language of most of the northern Florida area in the Spanish colonial period was Timucua. When the Franciscans came in the 16th century, they began learning the language and teaching the indigenous people here how to read and write. So, to put this Pareja text into a little context, this work was a collaboration made between these Franciscan friars who had just arrived and the Timucua people who long lived here. Unfortunately, the Timucua were eventually devastated by the effects of disease, slavery, and war, and while there was likely still some descendants alive today, the Timucua as a people no longer exist, and the language is unfortunately no longer spoken. So, finding a Timucua text is extremely rare. This is a very important discovery and will help future scholars in untold ways. So I'm very excited to meet with Dr. Johnson, and let's just go ahead and go learn a little bit more about this Pareja text.
Thank you very much, first of all, Beth, for this opportunity. I feel very, very lucky because a situation that developed in my life is what we would call, for people like me, a dream come true. And what do I mean by that? It's finding a book in your area of expertise that's important for your study, but also has a greater importance for culture and history. And that's what happened to me. I was working on my sabbatical, and I've been studying the writings of Francisco Pareja, a Franciscan who was here in this area, Northeast Florida, and actually for many, many years was a priest at the mission up by Jacksonville, San Juan del Puerto. In my studies, I came across an indication on an obscure website of a title of a book that I didn't recognize, but it was listed as Francisco Pareja. And I thought, I wonder if someone made a mistake there and they took the chapter of a book and thought it was a separate book when really maybe it was just a chapter within an already known book. But what happened is I looked at it closer and it had the date of 1628, and it had a title, like I said, a very interesting title. It essentially was How to Go to Mass, how to listen to Mass, and how to listen to the ceremonies that are involved in going to Mass for Catholics, Roman Catholics. I thought, no, that can't be it, because Pareja died, we believe, in 1628, and now we have a book that's got his name and that date. It really can't be true. And although I really wanted it to be true, I definitely wanted it to be true. So I'm looking at that, and it could be what is called a ghost listing, where someone at some point in time listed something that wasn't really there. But I was able to follow some leads and actually talk to a friend, colleague in Oxford, and I asked, how do I find out about what I think is an unknown book in one of your libraries there? So he got me in touch with the library at Souls. It's called Full Sail's Library, and at this point in time, it is working in very difficult situations because of COVID. But evidently, they were also interested in helping me, because I sent them a title. I said, "Is this by any chance in your holdings?" And they wrote back and they said, "Yes, it is." I said, and so I said, I'm like, calm Calm your enthusiasm, Tim. Calm your enthusiasm. And my wife is saying, don't get your hopes up. Don't get your hopes up. This cannot be true. But I said, so could you at least send me a picture of the front, if you will, the title page. So they did. They sent me the title page and the image of it, and I opened it up, and I'll never forget this. I opened up this page on my computer, and my heart started pounding because I recognized this is what I had been hoping. This is a completely unknown book by Francisco Pareja, and it is a commentary on how Christians should go to Mass, and it has Latin phrases from the Mass, but then a Timucua and a Spanish commentary on each part of the Mass.
Wow.
And what's significant, among other things, is that we recently did an archaeological dig here where we found a church, and we found where the Franciscans were living. So the book that was found could have actually been used at that very site,
wow.
right here on the mission grounds on Nombre de Dios. So I was looking at my computer screen, and I realized this truly is what I had dreamt that it would be. And I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking, I need a verification as well. I'm absolutely convinced that this is authentic. And I'm getting very excited for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is a book that's unknown. And for my colleague, George Aaron Broadwell, who teaches up at the University of Florida, this is going to be a gold mine for him because he is really the only person that knows Timucua well. And so every time we find more Timucua words, that definitely helps him because it allows him to increase his vocabulary of the database and gives us more ideas what these Timucua words can mean. So, and I've worked with him for now a couple of years. So I had written him earlier, and I had said, Aaron, have you ever heard of this book, 1628 about Mass? He said, no, never heard of anything like that. And I said, we should get together sometime and talk about it because I found this, this reference online. And he said, yeah, sure, we can get together sometime. And then what happened though is when that image appeared, I sent it to him immediately, and he wrote back and said, we need to meet. And I said, good, that's me. And so, of all places, in between St. Augustine and UF, we met in Flagler and had a nice fish lunch, and I pulled up the image, and we were like two little boys at Christmas time under the tree, just like, oh my goodness, look at this. And at a certain point in time, he stopped and he said, do you realize that I'm the only person, referring to himself, the only person who knows how to read this? And I said, yes, that's why we're here, that's why we're doing this. So it's exciting from the perspective of culture, of religion, and it's particularly meaningful for me because all the way back to my times as a student in doctoral studies, I've been studying the question of Franciscans in prayer. Actually, my dissertation is on St. Bonaventure and his theology of prayer. So for me to find a prayer book from the Franciscans a number of decades after I finished my dissertation sat really well with me. It's like, this was, I don't want to say made for me, but I'm so happy I was the one who found it because I'm studying the question of liturgy, prayer, and in particular how Christians, both Spanish and Timucua, manage their faith in a multicultural, multilingual space. So this textbook now leads us forward. It will be a textbook in the sense that we'll be really studying it and we'll be looking at all kinds of different aspects. I should have my first scholarly article out on this sometime in the fall. There'll be a popular article also through the St. Augustine Catholic magazine. But this is where we stand right now. There is a renaissance going on here in Florida with regards to history, archaeology, religion, language, and what is really driving force for me too is working with my students, because as I start to translate some of these texts, I then give them to my students in English, and we talk about them. And not only are they appreciative of the content per se, but to think that this actually came from here, where they grew up, that this is part of your cultural heritage, which is someone who lives in St. Augustine. And it brings to light, among many things, the fact that we used to think that the priests were really smart, and of course they were really smart. Some of the smartest actually were the first people to come to Florida. These were highly dedicated, highly educated men who were really willing to go on a dangerous mission. Florida was not well known. They came here, yes, intelligent, but we had this, or maybe just some of us had this idea that priests are really smart. They learn the Indian language, whatever it is, then they take whatever they have and then they put it into the Indian language. What we've been able to discover now is the phenomena of native indigenous writers. What that means is, when the friars came, they didn't obviously know Timucua. The Timucua didn't know Spanish. There might have been incidences of maybe someone who had washed ashore and had been taken captive, maybe have some background, but essentially they didn't know each other's languages. So how do you start? You typically start with children, and you start talking with children and start to develop a word list of words. This means this means that. And those of people, those of you who know another language or studied another language, realize that it's always much more easy and less intimidating to study a language with children, because when they laugh at you with your pronunciation, it's much different than when an adult laughs at you. So this is the process, getting to know each other, getting to know each other's words. But what happens then is the Timucua then are given a written language. And what I mean by that, the Franciscans would listen, and then they would ascribe letters to what they heard. So very quickly there emerges a Timucua language, a language that the Spanish believe is essential for them to evangelize, to catechize. They wanted new converts to be able to read the books about doctrines, the prayer books. So language becomes really important on both sides. But what we ultimately see then is that someone like Francisco Pareja, who probably gets in here to Florida 1595, starts working with priests and Timucua who are already here, Wale Indians probably as well, and they start putting together these little documents, written lists, maybe questions, all on parchment. And when it gets to the native language, Timucua, now that they have letters, the Spanish, like Pareja, would give something to his Timucua co-editors, and they would put it into Timucua. And it's not that they have a precise statement in Spanish that then the Timucua put into their language as a precise repetition of the Spanish. We actually see variety. We see how sometimes the Timucua expand on the idea. Sometimes they change the idea. Sometimes they have figures that appear in their stories that they use but are not in the Spanish. There's all kinds of examples. One that I've come across quite often is the Spanish insist on speaking of the devil as a serpent. It goes back to the Christian interpretation of Genesis. But when the Spanish use serpente for the devil, when the Timucua take that text, they never use the word snake. And they clearly in the text, they do not equate a snake with evil. So it's pretty fascinating, because time and time again they simply do not use the snake image. Now, if you're a Franciscan sitting down with your Timucua editor, you know that he has not put the Timucua word for snake in there, because anyone in Florida, Franciscan, who's been working here is going to know the word for snake. So they look and they see that it's not there. What are they doing then in this case? What they're doing is negotiating. The importance of the text is not that it contains the word snake. The importance is the lesson, the greater lesson about sin, conversion. So they negotiate, and they say, well, clearly for them, that word is not going to work, and it will not be accepted in their culture, because you can imagine snakes have both good and bad sides to them. They're not like a symbol of total evil. Sometimes they're a blessing, sometimes they're a curse, but they're not identified with the devil. So here we see how we have indigenous authors who are not just copying, not just reciting, but actually the technical term is glossing. Sometimes they'll gloss the story, they'll add something to it. Another great example is when they do the study in one of the catechisms of creation. The Timucua authors use Florida animals in a hierarchy to show what their creation story would look like if they were referring to their own animals. So we see right here that that is quite a change, and the Franciscans know that that's happening because they would know those basic words too, but they're giving the editorial control and development to their co-editors. So assuming these texts start to be published in 1612, typically there would be years of work leading up to that, where the language is acquired, word lists are written up, and then written notes are compiled to the point where you can then finally bring that and compose a book. So we know that Pareja publishes his first book in Timucua in 1612. It's a catechism. And we think he may have actually been in Mexico before coming, perhaps, to Florida, where he learned this process of working with different languages, because there is a text in Aztec and Spanish that may be by him as well. So it would appear that he learned the method of working with different scribes and editors and co-editors, came then to Florida, and pretty much as soon as he got here, he started developing, moving, writing, editing different texts that could then be used in the communities of Florida. So we have texts from 1612 all the way up to 1628 from Father Pareja. And what they do is they include something on baptism, something on communion, something on confession. So we are very privileged now with understanding the whole, what we would call pedagogical, pastoral trajectory of Father Pareja, together with his unknown, unnamed, but certainly co-authors from different Timucua tribes. We know that because we also find out in a later Franciscan by the name of Movilla, that in his introduction, his book, he talks about how they actually would do this. That they would sit down with elders, with catechists in the Timucua language, and flesh out with them what would work and what wouldn't in their communities once the Spanish and Latin were put into Timucua. Now, the book that I, by good fortune, came across and uncovered in Oxford is pretty unique also because it talks about going to Mass, and I contacted a colleague of mine in Mexico City who is quite knowledgeable about indigenous literature, and he told me that he knows of no other example of a bilingual catechism that's focused on the Mass. So this is really unique even as a genre in indigenous Spanish literature.
How many Timucua texts do we know about at this point?
Well, I mean, I have them here. We know of a catechism in 612, another catechism with doctrine in 612, the confession, this really quite enormous book teaching people how to go to confession, that's from 1613. Pareja did a grammar book that goes back to 1614, And that was actually the last book that was ever discovered. And that was over, I think, 130 years ago.
Wow.
So the one that I discovered is the first one discovered in 130 years.
That's amazing.
So people like me, like I said, this is what dreams are made of. Right?
Yes.
This is like, and then what happens is, there seems to be a break, and Father Pareja becomes what's called the provincial, which is the head person of the Franciscans in Florida. So he's involved in a lot of different things beyond writing. But then he goes back to Mexico, and then we start seeing reworking of some of the texts. So we get a reworking of a catechism in 1612. We get a new catechism for those who are going to go to communion, and then we get this text. Now, some scholars think that there might have been reprints of some of these other ones, but that's the basic flow. So we're looking at a number of texts, and then we also have two texts by a Franciscan by the name of Movilla, who is a little bit later, 1635, I believe his text came out. And he did an entire translation of a catechism into Timucua. And then, as he says in the foreword, he sat down with the different Timucua, and we can imagine that there was a community of indigenous Timucua and others in Mexico City to help translators. So he sits down with them, they rework some different things. He says, for example, when it comes to the Ten Commandments, we have to talk about them in a different way because this won't make sense when we talk to the Timucua about this because of the way they believe. So then, when he finishes that up, his confreres look at it and say, we would actually like much more material to help us. So then he adds a whole another part on this book from 1635 that has what my wife and I are working on now, sermon stories. So there's what are called exempla, which are stories that a preacher would take and use. For example, I got to preach on humility. Well, is there a good story somewhere? So there were books with different stories. Oh, this is a great story. I like this story. So there are a number of these stories that are in Spanish and Timucua. So my wife and I are doing a study of the stories that talk about women. So we want to see what were the images of women that were being circulated in St. Augustine through preaching. So we're very thankful for not only Movilla's work, but also the texts that Pareja has that have those stories.
That's exciting.
I brought this book along to show, as an example, of the types of books that would have been circulating in the 1600s, the 1700s here in St. Augustine, and would have been most likely familiar to the friars. Here you have one that was published, you can see here, 1737, and it is published in Mexico. And that's an important point because Mexico City becomes quite dominant in the production of bilingual texts. And you can see here, it's a directory of information for those who want to take the habit of St. Francis. So this book here is guiding people who want to become Franciscans. So here we end here with a prayer and a nice wood carving. Remember, medieval manuscripts were illuminated. By the time we get to the early modern period, of course, we have print, and we have a number of different images that are used by publishers. And what's another unique feature of this is you can see here that someone actually at a certain point in time inserted these pages into this older book and talks about their decision to become a Franciscan. So we have a bit of a more modern, relatively speaking, but it shows how the book was in use over time. How it got to the book dealer, I don't know. But here you have typically table of contents in these older books is in the back. And then you can see here the vellum, which is leather, and you can see the remnants of how they were tied together. What will happen now is this book will go off for restoration, and these will be replaced, and this will be shined up. You actually like people touching this because it's leather. keeps it moist.
That's really beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for sharing all of this information with us, and we're so grateful to you.
My pleasure.
And we look forward to reading some more about this text in the fall.
Definitely, I'm a very lucky guy, and one of my big desires now is to develop what has been discovered, study it, but also share it with people. And I thank you so much for this opportunity to share it in this wonderful way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you so much for joining me. That was so interesting and I learned so much. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about the Timucua that lived in this area, or the history of the 16th century in St. Augustine, we have all kinds of books at the St. Johns County Public Library System. You can ask anybody in the library to help you, or you can look online on our catalog, www.sjcpls.org. Thank you again so much for watching, and we hope to see you soon at the library. Bye-bye.